I'm Rick Becker, host of the Irish Baseball Podcast, joined today by Sammie Samuels. Sammie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, you work at the Irish American Museum in Baltimore, and let's just get started with the fact that over there you're going through a rebrand. So, why don't you talk about your old name and why you chose to have this evolution to the Irish American Museum?
So, the museum actually started 23 years ago. And when they first started, they were actually just trying to save the houses. And because we are a historic house museum, and one of our houses is still in that 1848 appearance. So, they originally started to save the houses. And through their research, they found out that the houses themselves were actually built for railroad workers that were working at the B&O. But then through further research, they found out that that whole neighborhood was predominantly an Irish neighborhood. So hence the name Irish Railroad Workers Railroad Workers Museum when they started. And throughout the years, yes, we have told the stories of Irish railroad workers and their families and their communities and kind of the legacy they left on America, hence the shift towards Irish American Museum, because we are now more inclusive in the stories that we are telling. We talk about what women were doing in the communities. We talk about more than just railroad workers. We have so many things coming down the pipes to expand those stories and give a space where all Irish Americans and people of not Irish descent can learn about this history, this culture that has been so integral to shaping the America that we know today.
As you mentioned, you are just about a block away from the Baltimore, Ohio Railroad Museum. And that is such a big part of Irish history. We talk a lot about the coal miners in Pennsylvania, in New York, but we also need to talk about the railroad workers, especially in Baltimore. That was such a big part of it. And even out west, there were a lot
Mhm.
of Irish railroad workers. But as you start to expand, what made that decision relevant? Was it more something that happened organically? You just found yourself telling more stories, you found yourselves finding more stories, or was it a conscious effort to tell more stories?
Well, it's kind of both. So I started working at the museum and took over from the director about almost 4 years ago now. And when I took over, they weren't really telling women's stories at all. So that is something I have strived to make more inclusive, be conscious of it in that manner. However, when I took over, they had already been telling this expanded stories. They weren't just focusing on the railroad workers. They were talking about the steel workers in New York. They were talking about the coal miners in Pennsylvania. They were also talking about the masons in Texas, Maryland, which unfortunately does not exist anymore. So they were already telling this wide variety of stories, but the name kind of confused people, so they thought we were a train museum. They thought we had model trains on display. That is just not the case. They also confused us with the B&O a lot. So we, for a while there, were telling people if you want to know about the trains themselves, visit the B&O. If you want to know about the people who built the trains, come see us. So um, the shift away from that was more of we have this wonderful community because our museum is 99.99999% community funded. We do not get a lot of grants from the federal or state government. We are actually the only Irish museum in the Mid-Atlantic region. There are only six in the entire country, and we are one of them. So because of all of that, we wanted to make it more accessible to the general public. And we were already telling stories that weren't really railroad stories anyway. So it was more representative of what we were doing as an institution, also.
It's kind of funny because I can relate a little bit to that when I have been reaching out for the 250th anniversary of the United States and trying to find people with Irish history stories.
Mhm.
And they'll be emailing me back saying, but I don't know anything about baseball. And it's like, no, it doesn't have to be about baseball. We're trying to cover all of these stories. But as I am focusing on the 250th anniversary of the United States and trying to tell some of these Irish stories involved in it. Your organization, more than any I have talked to, is going above and beyond to highlight the contributions Irish immigrants and Irish Americans have made to the country in the last 250 years. So, why don't you share something about that?
So we, and this is, it's not just you. All of my colleagues that I've talked to that are museum people here in Baltimore are also very shocked because we are, as far as I know, the only institution that is doing something every single month for the 250th next year. We are doing 250 years of Irish American history in 12 months. And every month has a different theme. Every month we will be looking at a different aspect of what Irish history, Irish American history looks like in this country. Starting in January, we're looking at colonial days and pre-colonial days. And a lot of people have this misconception that the Irish came over only in the famine. And that is not the case. They were brought over as indentured servants. Some of them were kidnapped off their land and sold into service. So we will be talking about that in January. And then it goes throughout the year. We'll be focusing on labor history, on sports history. We'll also be doing cultural things because a lot of the holidays we celebrate come from Irish traditions, and not a whole lot of people know that. We will do doing those kinds of things, but we'll also be doing a book club where you can learn and read about Irish American history. We're doing a huge blog post on our website that's called I Am America, an Irish Chronicle, and it will fit with the theme of whatever month we're doing. So you'll get an in-depth dive into a very specific portion of that history. And it's so fun. We are actually about to launch the whole calendar on our socials and our website soon. I was just finishing up that this morning. So we have all the events already scheduled. There's over 25 different events, lectures, in-person events, all kinds of stuff coming down the pipes. And a lot of them will be hybrid. So they'll be in person and virtual. So you can tune in from wherever you are. You don't have to be in Baltimore, which is great.
That is so amazing. And I just want to talk about something like, for example, Ken Burns did his American Revolution documentary that was recently released, and people have been talking about that, whether they liked it, whether they didn't. It's not really important. But I do think a lot of things that happen in documentaries like that is we tend to focus on the politicians or the generals, and we focus on the people who are big marquee names. But one of the things that was great about your organization when it was the Irish Railroad Workers Museum, but also even in the transition as you start to talk more about women and their contributions, is you're focusing on regular people, the people who aren't presidents, who aren't generals, who maybe aren't the decision makers, but are playing just as big of a part in the growth of the United States as these people who go into the history books.
Well, and it's funny. We talk to a lot of people who don't really know what to make of us when we first talk about the museum. And one of the things we tell them is nobody famous ever lived in our houses. We actually own 6 houses now. Eventually, the museum will be in 5 of those 6 houses, and we will have a genealogy and Irish history research and resource library as part of the expanded campus. But in that, the people who lived on our block were candy makers, boiler makers, seamstresses, blacksmiths. They were not people like Andrew Jackson, huge Irish American, president. But we have everybody talking about him. We have nobody talking about James and Sarah Feely, who are our family that lived in one of the houses for over 20 years. They made that house. It was bought for them by her brother-in-law, and then they bought it from her brother-in-law and turned it into a rental property. Those stories, as we know it in Irish American culture, they're passed down through families, but they're not talked about on a global scale. And on top of that, we also have very interesting pieces of history. For example, Irish suffragettes were arrested on the White House steps for burning Woodrow Wilson's speech during their march to get the right to vote. We also have Fanny Sellens, who lost her life fighting for better working conditions in the coal mines. She was actually murdered for fighting for those rights. So we have these very intricate parts of what makes up America as we know it. The 5-day work week, OSHA, MSHA. We owe Irish Americans, among others, the rights for those things. They fought very hard for it because they're the ones who led the path in the labor movement. They're the ones that led the path in the 19th Amendment and getting women the right to vote. They were also on the front lines fighting for civil rights. We have this Irish She Is series because Irish women in particular did not leave a lot behind, a lot of paperwork, so it's really hard to get their stories. And if you know anything about Irish culture, it's a matriarchal society. Women kind of rule the roost. So they're the ones that kept the families together. Irish immigrants were the only immigrant group that I know of that women out immigrated men. So they were the ones that started those migration chains. They were the ones that brought their families over and started their communities. And they are the ones that were the backbones behind the labor movement. They were the ones that were negotiating salaries before it was a thing. We have a domestic that sued her employers in Boston in 1853 and won. So we have all of these very interesting pieces that make up this large puzzle that is America. And those stories, unfortunately, are not talked about. They're not really taught in schools. They're not part of the curriculum because they aren't people of note. And for instance, Baltimore, huge Irish community. The word Baltimore is Irish, and most Baltimoreans don't know that. So we have this very rich and deep history, but because it's nobody famous and because it's nobody that it's a household name, they kind of are getting lost to history. So we're trying to make sure that their stories and their sacrifices are remembered for the next generation.
And it's kind of amazing that, not that they're allowing you to do this, but I find a lot of times organizations that need to rely on the community, that need to rely on donations, they don't like to, step out and tell some of these other stories because it's so easy to tell the same stories that will bring in the donations, that will, be easy to sell to corporations or things like that. But you are telling these individual stories and they are allowing you to tell these stories when it might be a slower burn to build up. Like you said, you've purchased more houses and you're expanding the museum, but that probably could have happened a lot faster if you were just like, oh, here are the big famous names. But you're not doing that. And I think that's really important.
That's actually to that point. That was something I started the Irish She Is series. It goes up on our socials every March, every single day. There's a 1 minute video. You get to learn about a different woman that you probably know nothing about, but you probably should. Um, But when I started that series, I made a very conscious decision that the first series was going to be women that you didn't know. They
Mhm.
might have been somewhat familiar, for instance, Leonora O'Reilly or Margaret Hinchy or Margaret Foley. They're huge in the labor movement and in the suffragist movement. However, most of the women in that first series were people from our community. It was their ancestors. So we have a teacher. A lot of the nuns out of St. Peter's were in that series. And then when I did the second, and now when I'm getting ready to do the third, we've incorporated some of those famous names, but we do it from a side of, hey, yeah, you know this person, but do you really know everything they did? So we did Maureen O'Hara. We did Jackie Kennedy. Jackie Kennedy was the force behind preserving the White House and turning it into a museum that you could tour and do all of those things. She spearheaded that, and not a whole lot of people know that she spearheaded that. She actually won an Emmy as the First Lady. Crazy. So you have all of these other pieces to these people. They are very depth rich in stories. And when you're talking about the well-known names, there's still parts of those people that the American public does not know a whole lot about. Did you know Maureen O'Hara was the first woman to fly a private commercial airliner in
Wow.
America? Because I didn't, but I found out when I was doing my research. So you have all these little nuances that you can really build these wonderful pictures of what America was like. Maureen O'Hara is also the reason why, if you're immigrating to the US as an Irish immigrant, you can claim Ireland as your home country. She sued the US government for that right. So you have all of those things, but people don't realize it's there. And they don't realize it's there because this story isn't elevated. It's not one of the hot button issues. It's not one of those things that people, when they think of minority stories or unheard stories or underutilized voices, they don't think of the Irish because everybody in America just assumes, oh yeah, there's this person down the road that has Irish ancestry, or oh yeah, St. Patrick's Day, that's the Irish holiday. There are so many other Irish holidays that exist on the calendar, and even just that little tidbit is amazing when you start talking about it. For example, Samhain, which is our Halloween, comes from Irish and Scottish immigrants. They made it popular. That's why we celebrate. But those stories, those traditions, for instance, when I took over the museum, most of my board did not know a lot of the traditions that I now talk about and we now have events for at the museum. I grew up with them, they did not. And that's part of the struggle. We have 3 or 4 generations where the history was not talked about, it
Hmm.
was not spoken of, you did not ask questions, none of those things. And then you have my generation and generations after me that are very curious and want to know this history, but it's been lost because people didn't talk about it. So we are trying to get people to talk about it and share their stories. We have this wonderful thing called the Shamrock Legacy at the museum, where if you work with us and we do a lot of research for you on our end for it, but you can actually preserve your family's story at the museum. So we do the genealogical research, we find those stories, we figure out what was going on, and then we publish it on our website and we keep it in our archives for the next person who comes along who might have a connection to that family or a connection to that story in some way. So it's a lot.
One of the reasons that focusing on these underappreciated stories, like you have a house that was the house of an actual family. The man worked at the railroad. Because of that, you are able to do events like the one I attended in November, where you have a wake
Yep.
and you know that there actually was a child in that family who passed away while they lived at that house. So there would have been a wake for this
Mhm.
child in that house. And you're able to show what the average working class Irish person in Baltimore would have done when this horrible tragedy hit their family. Why don't you talk a little bit about the wake that you do every year and how important that is to telling the story of Irish people in Baltimore?
Well, and it's funny because yes, we tell the story of we're very geographically centered in Baltimore, but you can see parallels to how things are done in Baltimore that would have been done in Pennsylvania, in Boston, in Chicago. New York's a little different because of the tenements, but when you come to our houses, we've had people come from California, from Milwaukee, and they're like, "Oh yeah, my grandfather had a house just like this out in Milwaukee, and this is what happened." But the wake specifically and events like the wake, so you actually walk back in time. We put you back in those spaces so you can see exactly what those families were dealing with space-wise, what they were dealing with how do we have this funeral for this child that just passed away. And in the case of Sarah, poor Sarah, she had 10 children. She lost 4 of them before they ever made it to adulthood. So we do know that William, the child that we throw the wake for every year, did pass away in that house, but he was also born in that house. So it's a very full circle moment for that family. And 4 months before he passed away, they had another son. And that son's middle name is actually William. So they had some inkling that something was not going well with William. But we throw an Irish wake. And for people who don't know Irish culture, Irish wakes are It sounds really morbid, but it's a big party. And depending on who's passed away, it's a big party. If they're somebody who has lived a very long life, it's a raucous party where you're storytelling, you're laughing, you're drinking, you're basically celebrating life. And that's actually where modern celebrations of life come from, is this Irish tradition of the wake and making sure that that person's memory is honored in the way that they would have wanted it to be honored. However, if it's a child, it's a little different normally. Ours is a huge party, but that's because William would have been 150 this year. So ours is a little bit different. We do throw up the party side of it, but when it was a child, it was a very somber event. It was very much mourning that person, but wakes were held in the home. You didn't go to a funeral parlor. Funeral parlors actually get their name because bodies were laid out in the parlors of the houses, which is what you see when you come to our wake. We actually have William laid out in the parlor. So you get that wonderful connection to the history. You get to step back in time, but we also make the food that goes with every event. So at the wake, we serve you what it would have been served at an 1870s wake. So Irish stew, colcannon, those types of things, because it was tradition. I don't know about you, but I know my family, we don't have any kind of event without food. Like it does not happen. And my grandmother would roll in her grave if we didn't have food. So it's part of that culture is you always have food. And the Irish in particular have certain dishes that coincide with certain things. Like we have a wake cake recipe that we give out normally at the wake. And that is part of those wakes. Christmas fruitcake is another one. And also the Irish wedding cake. Those take months to prepare because you have to bathe them with rum and whiskey and all those other things. But those traditions are even being lost, not just the cultural traditions, but our food is being lost. We're working on a cookbook right now at the museum because that food tradition is also being lost. And it's weird because when I tell people that we're serving traditional Irish dishes, they're like, wait, Irish people don't have a cuisine. I'm like, oh yes, yes they do. This is why. This is why this is so important. And so we have that kind of thing, but also the wake is just it's one of our best events that we do all throughout the year. It sells out so quickly because it's so popular. And it's interesting because you wouldn't think that a funeral is going to be popular, but we play wake games in the backyard. Bet you didn't know funerals involved games, did you? So all of those fun aspects of funerals that were Irish funerals that still go on to this day. It's still lasting tradition, and we are trying to uphold that and make sure that it doesn't get lost. It doesn't get characterized because that is a big problem with Irish history. We have all of these very unpleasant characters that pop up through history that are not true to who and what the Irish people and Irish culture are. And a lot of people have forgotten that those caricatures exist. They don't know that the derogatory slurs that were being thrown at the Irish people are still being thrown at them today. Those types of things. So that's why the wake is important. That's why we do it the way we do it and why we make sure that we're trying to stay as authentically true to history as we possibly can.
One of the other things about the wake is because there are so many people who show up for it, and then you take turns going into the house and seeing the setup for the wake. And even, if there's 10 people in there, it's so packed. And you think, like, this house is tiny. But then you realize for that family, that was a huge luxury to have this house in Baltimore City because when they came over from Ireland, over in Ireland, they might have had a one-room house.
Yeah, more than likely it probably would have been one room. We just had a friend of the museum and we were so lucky. They were in Ireland and they tracked down James's family home in Ireland. So we actually have a picture of what their family home looked like. And it looks like we don't have a picture of the inside, but we have a picture of the outside. And it looks like it would have been at least two rooms. But you're talking about when these immigrants came over, they were coming from dirt floors, open hearth cooking, very very run down shacks is what we think of them now in America, but they were sod houses. And so they were not these lavish brick and mortar houses. Most of the Irish immigrants were on rented land in Ireland and had either been kicked off or the lease hadn't been renewed or something. And then when they came to America, like I said, New York is different because of the tenements, but most other places they were in these tiny little row homes, or homes like a row home where it's very small, or if you were going out west you were in dugouts, so you were literally digging into the mountain to make your home. And so the fun thing about that photo that we have of the Feely family home in Ireland is we know for a fact that house would have fit on the first floor of their house in Baltimore. So the entire house would have fit on their first floor in Baltimore.
Wow.
Our row homes are 10 and a half feet wide by 24 and a half feet deep, and they're two-story and attic row homes. So you don't even have a full third story. The poor kids, they're dealing with waking up and maybe hitting their heads on rafters because the ceiling's slanted down in that third floor. And also, it's a huge luxury when they get to Baltimore or Pennsylvania or Boston, wherever they ended up. It's a luxury. They're moving into what could have been considered a mansion at the time. And the ones that did well for themselves eventually did move into what would have been considered tiny mansions. They had indoor plumbing, they had all of these wonderful things that were huge advancements over what they came from in Ireland. And the cool thing about that is they made sure that their children remembered where they came from. So we still have those oral traditions of, oh, yeah, my grandmother was on a dirt floor and it was two rooms and they had their spinning wheel outside because it couldn't fit in the house. So mom did her spinning outside instead of inside. Sarah's got a great Canadian spinning wheel in her parlor. That never would have happened in Ireland. It's just too big. So you have all these really cool instances where you can compare and contrast what they came from and how well they did for themselves once they got here.
You definitely focus on preserving the culture. And another way that you do that is through you have Irish language classes, you have knitting classes. You are really doing a lot. So when you talk about the book club, it goes even beyond that, where you have a bunch of different events to make sure that you are keeping the culture alive.
Yeah, specifically, our Irish language classes are actually open for registration right now for the spring session. They'll start in January and they run 16 weeks, but it's completely on Zoom. You do not have to be at the museum to take them. Conversely, the museum does occasionally host Gale Talks where you can come and practice your Irish with other people who speak the language because the language is dying, or it was. It's kind of stabilizing a little bit. It's still in danger of being lost, but it's stabilizing a little bit thanks in part to Ireland putting it back in schools, thanks in part to this second resurgence we have of people being very interested to learn the language. It's definitely a different sounding language. It's not really English based, it's not really Latin based. So when you're learning, it can be a little difficult at first, but the way our instructor, we partner with this wonderful company out of Pennsylvania called Irish Language Learners, and they teach through songs, poems, stories. You get to see just how different the language sounds on something that sounds familiar to you. And with the lace classes, Irish lace was hugely coveted in this country. There were women that were making hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars off of their products that they were selling, whether it be curtains or tablecloths or dresses, what have you. And it was a huge cottage industry. It gave women extra income to make sure that their families stay fed, but it's a dying art form. And we're actually losing that art form. A lot of the patterns were oral patterns that people just remembered and passed down to their daughters. So we have this wealth of patterns out there that have been recreated because the original patterns don't exist anymore. And so we have the lace class at the museum. I'm actually writing the curriculum for next year's right now. Um, so we'll have that again next year, just because when we did it this past summer, we had so many people that came and never had crocheted in their life, had never done anything, and they were making doilies by the end of it. They were producing these wonderful crafts, and they could look at it and say, I made that, and that's part of my heritage. Because people don't think about those things as part of your heritage. They don't think about skills like lace making or even the book club. In the book club, some of the books that we have are non-traditional books. For January, one of the options is an account of an indentured servant from Baltimore. One of the other options further throughout the year is a cookbook. And so you have these different takes on history, and I feel like most people think history is one dimensional, and it's not. It's three-dimensional. You have to look at it from all sides and all aspects. So if you're reading something, it doesn't have to be academic. It can be a cookbook. That's still history. That's still culture. Or if you're reading somebody's diary, for example, that is still history. That is still culture. That is somebody's perspective on what the world was like for them at that point in time. And it gives you a different way to view events that we've always been told about. For example, Pearl Harbor or um, World War II, or even the Civil War. Some of those diaries from the Civil War paint a vastly different picture than what is taught in school. So it's very interesting to see those points of view and offer a different way to connect with that history because you can't just talk about it. You've got to have some way for people to experience it and connect with it on a different level.
So, one of the things that I love about your museum is that it is very accessible. And by that, I mean it can be part very easily of a big Baltimore day. If you are coming from out of town, because of the nature of our listeners, I'm going to focus on somebody coming into town for an Orioles game at Oriole Park at Camden Yards. And Oriole Park at Camden Yards is one of the best ballparks in the country. And if you have not been there, you should go there. But for example, last year, I had a day. I started at the Irish American Museum. Then we went over to the Guinness
Mhm.
Brewery in Baltimore. We took a tour at the Guinness Brewery. We had lunch there. And then we drove past where Babe Ruth played his baseball as a child when he played
Mhm.
at St. Mary's, the old baseball field from St. Mary's has been revitalized. The building has not.
No.
But you can see where Babe Ruth played baseball. And then you can go to the Babe Ruth birthplace and
Mhm.
museum, which is like 2 blocks away from Oriole Park at Camden Yards. All of these things, if you're into Edgar Allan Poe, who was Irish, Edgar Allan Poe, his home is just a couple blocks away
Mhm.
from the Irish American Museum. If you're interested in trains, the B&O Railroad Museum is right there. So there is so much to do in this area. And I think that's one of the best aspects of your museum because you don't have to spend 5 hours there. You can go for an hour, 2 hours, and really get a good view of everything that you have to offer there.
Well, and it's funny, a lot of people, Baltimore in itself has this conception in the general public who doesn't live here that there's nothing here. And it's so far from the truth. We have over 60 museums in Baltimore. And it's even funnier to me because a lot of those museums are interconnected and people don't make the connection either. For example, B&O Railroad Museum. A lot of the people who lived in our neighborhood worked at the B&O. If you want to see the history of trains and the first railroad in America, go to the B&O. If you want to see who built the trains, come to us. And if you want to see who owned the B&O, you can go to the Evergreen Museum and Library and see John Wark Garrett's son's mansion, where they have a gold toilet and we don't have running water in our house. So it's a very interesting connection. And those are all in, well, the B&O and our museum are in the same neighborhood, but they're all, the other museum is in a different neighborhood. But if you go by neighborhood, you can take 2 or 3 days and hit a different neighborhood and easily get to see 4 or 5, sometimes 6 museums because a lot of them are harbored in those neighborhoods. In our neighborhood, we have Edgar Allan Poe's house, we have H.L. Mencken's house, we have the B&O, us, Babe Ruth Birthplace Museum. So it's very interesting when you start to look at Baltimore and start to see the shift and how culture is represented here. And that's the wonderful thing about Baltimore. Culture is celebrated here. They want all of those unique museums. They love having all of those unique museums. And you can easily get to all of them. We have a free transportation bus that takes you around the city. So you have all of these wonderful resources here, and people don't know it exists. So it's kind of this wonderful hidden gem. So you can still make a day, 2 days. You can come for a weekend and see maybe a fraction of the city and still not see everything. So the other interesting thing that we have is Baltimore had three immigration points. Two of them are in Baltimore City proper. One you can't really get to. The other one is near Fort McHenry. So if you really want to learn about the immigration, you can go to Fort McHenry, see the first immigration point across the harbor, go down the street a little ways and go see the immigration museum where the second immigration point was. So you have all this wonderful history that's not just War of 1812, that's not just Revolutionary War history, that's not just train history. It's so diverse and so interconnected and dependent on what you are interested in, you can go see where John Wilkes Booth is buried. Like, even that is in Baltimore. It's crazy the amount of history that is here.
So if somebody wants to sign up for one of these Zoom classes, or if they want to become a member, or just visit when they're in Baltimore, where can they go?
So you can either follow us on Facebook or Instagram. The handles are our name, Irish American Museum. On Instagram, it's Irish_American_museum. Or you can go on our website, which is www.irishamericanmuseum.org. And all of our upcoming events are under the in-person or virtual events tab. If you want to become a member, it's under the support tab. So everything is on our website, everything is on our socials. We are extremely active on all three of those accounts because we're just trying to make sure everybody gets the information.
As you can tell from this interview, Sammie Samuels is very, very busy. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us on the Irish Baseball Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.